Yellow and Red by Digits 27, Chapter 32. Naruto looked over the sprawling desert that stretched out endlessly in every direction. After so long as a shinobi such as after so long a shinobi such as after so long a shinobi such as I was so long was no longer as intimidating as it had been when he first set eyes on it. He knew how to survive even in the harshest of conditions, how to find water, what you could and couldn't eat. He actually had a smile on his face as he walked calmly through the shifting sand beneath his feet. His instincts told him he should have been unhappy. He had only been in Tsunagakure for 3 days before he had to leave again. For 2 years, no less. He wouldn't be able to see his friends or girlfriend in all that time, and they could only communicate scarcely. Even so, the young blonde felt excited. Felt exhilarated. This was the first time he had been truly on his own for 7 years. He could literally do whatever he wanted. To punctuate that fact, Naruto just randomly did a flip through the air, landing with vulpine grace on the unsteady sand. He laughed to himself, a blonde madman laughing as he strolled casually through an impenetrable desert, only a map in his hand and the clothes in his back, as well as the 50 or so storage seals dotted around his body out of sight. He sighed to himself as he picked up the space, eager to get out of the desert as soon as he could. He was only slightly sad because Tair had to set out on her own mission because he left, only having a limited window of opportunity to infiltrate Sasori's network. He had bid her farewell from the gate, and she had returned the favor with gusto, as Naruto recalled, licking his lips with a smirk. Of course, that meant she couldn't be there to see him off on his own adventure, but at least Gaara and Baki-sensei had been there, offering him words of encouragement and advice. Of course, Baki was only there to tell him not to do anything that would make Suna look bad, but Naruto caught the sentiment between the words anyway. Nobody could say he didn't appreciate what the veteran had taught him over the years, even if his methods were questionable at best. Him and Uncle were similar in that regard, methods both eccentric and slightly sadistic, but both having his best interests at heart. He wondered if he just had a tendency to attract the stranger teachers. He chuckled, figuring he would know that once he found a sensei for his lightning affinity. He pulled open the detailed map and quickly located his position based off of the position off of the sun and local landmarks like noticeable rock formations. Naruto knew if he was captured, this would be the first thing he destroyed or sealed. It contained far too much information about the deserts of Wind Country to get into enemy hands. To be honest, Naruto was surprised Gaara trusted him with it. He knew the Sun Desert like the back of his hand, but he had never been to the land of valleys before, his first destination. Nearly a day of almost non-stop sprinting and tree hopping later, Naruto finally reached the border of Land of Valleys. He was forced to skim the border of Rain Country and River Country before cutting through the northwest of Fire Country before finally reaching the border. He had to be rather careful now. While the Land of Valleys held no alliance with other nations, it bordered Earth Country, and their patrols were known to stray from the country's borders. Naruto had once wondered what it would be like to hinge into the fourth Hokage and just take a stroll into the Earth Country. Even after death, the man still technically had a flea on sight order, and Naruto was curious if such a thing still applied. Naruto sighed. Naruto figured he could do a pretty good impression of the man, especially considering he knew two of the man's more recognizable techniques, including the one that struck fear into the hearts of Iwo shinobi everywhere. In the end, he was talked out of it rather harshly, but Gaara and Taia, who told him he would probably end up kickstarting the Fourth Shinobi War, he thought that was a bit of an exaggeration, but after their heated glares, he dropped the subject quickly. Still, he figured it would be pretty hilarious to see a few Iwanians piss themselves if he suddenly appeared in their midst as Minato Namikaze himself. I thought for another time. Right now, Naruto was more concerned with scoping out the surrounding environment. He always did this when he encountered somewhere unfamiliar. It always paid to know your way out. He unsealed the kunai and drove it as hard as he could into a nearby tree, far enough that he couldn't make out the three prongs. He hoped that anybody who passed who passed it would just ignore it as a normal kunai. He was still just technically in fire country, so even if it was found, it would probably just be treated as a relic of the last shinobi war. His escape route set he quickly hopped past the border into the land of valleys itself, moving as subtly and silently as his training allowed. He knew that Takegakure was a small village, larger than the recently formed Hoshigakure, but still dwarfed by the 5 main nations. However, that didn't mean they weren't still shinobi. As proof, he could smell more than a few of their outlying patrols moving around the thick forest around him. That was another thing he noticed. While Fire Country was well known for their forestry, it had nothing on the land of valleys. It seemed like the entire country was just one massive jungle that stretched out an impressive distance until it met the borders of its neighboring countries. There was so much forest, he wondered if the country had been misnamed. The general dampness that clung to everything messed with his sense of smell a bit, forcing him to rely on his hearing more than usual. Even with that small handicap, he managed to make it through the patrols unnoticed. If he could outrun and hide from Anbu-level shinobi in both Konoha and Suna, then he could deal with a few tuning guards that didn't even know he was there. He smirked, finding it all a little too easy as he finally broke out of the suffocating foliage of the jungle and found an awe-inspiring sight. Takegakure was, in a word, beautiful. It sat up high on the largest cliff Naruto had ever seen as its trademark waterfall crashed over the side in its strangely calm pool below it. He could make out the outlines of buildings and walls high on the cliff, but he knew that with all that water, plus the sheer height of the cliff itself, would make walking up extremely difficult and climbing plain suicidal. The main thing he saw through was the absolutely enormous tree that proudly grew in the center of the village. It dwarfed any building he had ever seen before and must have been as tall as the Wave Country Bridge as long. However, he didn't let any of that dishearten him. He steeled his resolve, knowing that the shinobi of the village must have a way in, and it would only be a matter of time before he found it. Naruto just took back his earlier sentiment. He had spent 3 days now circling the village, avoiding the patrols while simultaneously searching for the way the shinobi entered. He had of course found it. They approached the massive waterfall by walking across the lake, and it parted to give them entry. Somehow, Naruto didn't think that strategy would work for him, and he had spent his time searching for another way. What confused him was that there must have been a civilian way to enter the village, but he had yet to find it. He knew they were called ninja villages, but the entire village of Takegakure couldn't have been solely comprised of shinobi, could it? He couldn't even go around. The cliff that supported the village just seemed to stretch on forever in either direction. To go around, he would have to actually enter another country before doing a U-turn and going all the way back, and that would just take too long. Finally, he had gotten to the point where Naruto's patience had worn too thin, and he decided to risk the cliff. He waited until the darkest part of the night. The moon was thin, so he had a good cover of darkness as he set out towards the impressive lake. He kept on the lookout for any returning shinobi. He knew he would be stuck if any exited the village. His senses wouldn't be able to warn him in time, thanks to the waterfall which masked their presence. He dashed across the lake, his body so light that he didn't even make a ripple on its surface. He would have used the kunai to traverse the distance easily, but the sound of it hitting the cliff face might alert somebody. It suddenly gave him the idea to create a seal that projected a small field similar to a private seal to cancel out the sound a kunai made, but he put that thought to one side. It was a bit late to be readjusting his plan. He made it across the lake without incident, still very agitated due to the fact any number of shinobi could burst out of that waterfall without him knowing beforehand. He looked up the cliff face. He had thought it looked intimidating from his camp, but it was nothing compared to staring at it up close. He had to crane his head back all the way, just picking out its edge in the dim light of the night. Taking a deep breath, he first placed one foot on the wall, then another, slowly but surely walking upwards. Due to the thin coat of moisture, it proved difficult to stick to the wall using chakra. He was simultaneously using the water walking exercise and the tree climbing exercise, which despite their similarities were quite different. While tree climbing focused on forming your chakra into a vacuum to stick to the surface, the water walking technique used your chakra to repel the water because more than often than not, it would be below you. Even so, by taking it slowly and being extra careful with both his footing and his chakra control, Naruto managed to make steady progress up the sheer face. He froze suddenly as he heard the sound that had become familiar to him over the past 3 days. The ever-present background noise of the waterfall seemed to dim as he heard the water split into two mighty streams by some unknown source. He heard the jovial voice of a few shinobi as they exited their village on some mission or another. Unfortunately, that had the side effect of moving some of the water of the waterfall slightly closer to Naruto. The resulting moisture built up on the stone, and the rock around him suddenly made his job sticking to the wall that much difficult. A few beads of cold sweat managed to make their way through his brow to his chin, with him unable to wipe them off for fear of even the slightest movement giving away his position. Suddenly, his worst fear came to light as one of his feet slipped, quickly giving way to the other as he used too little chakra and lost his suction. His eyes opened wide in a brief moment of panic before his hands instinctively shot out, grasping a life-saving handhold on the slippery rock. Unfortunately for him, that simply moved to loosen some rock from the wall, and almost in slow motion he saw some pebbles fall past him and drop with small splashes that might as well have been bombs. Naruto's heart froze in his chest as one of the departing Takin stopped, looking behind him at the fresh ripples moving through the water. The man's hand immediately went for the kunai in his pouch, while his eyes pierced through the darkness above him, searching for even the slightest thing out of place in their precious cliff face. Naruto just waited with bated breath, hoping his hinge would be enough as he lay back against the wall, using the entirety of his body to stick off the cliff. "Hurry up, you baka! We're on a time here." Naruto had to hold back the immense sigh of relief as the female member of the team slapped the suspicious man on the back of the head, ushering for him to continue. The man seemed to instantly lose interest with his small suspicion, and the cliff face to turn to his teammate and nod like a kicked puppy. Naruto found the interaction somewhat familiar, but at the moment he could have kissed the kunoichi. That was, if it wouldn't have gotten him surely captured and killed, if not by Take then by Taiya when she found out. The team moved on, leaving the lake and subconsciously Naruto behind, while he finally released that small sigh and continued to scale the rock, this time using both his hands and his feet for added security. Right now, he somewhat resembled a gecko as he scaled the cliff, wondering all the while why he hadn't thought to do this in the first place. It was much less nerve-wracking. He finally rolled over at the top of the cliff, panting from the exertion both from both the cliff and both chakra exercises put on his body. Even that didn't stop the smile spreading across his face when he turned his head and saw one of the best signs in his life, the Watsutake in all of their glory. Naruto walked through the streets calmly, long having learned the secrets of blending in with civilian populaces. At least it answered his question about Takagakure and civilians. However, that did open up the question of just where the civilian entrance was exactly. The question was too bothersome for him right now, and would probably lead to a distracting argument in his head, something he didn't need when the situation required focus. Currently, he was reaching out with Kyuubi's chakra subtly to try and locate similar sources. He didn't find it hard. The other Jinchuriki obviously didn't have a good grasp on their resident chakra. Either that, or the seal was weak or weakening, and Naruto wasn't sure which was more worrying. Unfortunately for him, that was where his good luck ended. While he could detect the chakra presence nearby, with the crowds around pinpointing it because of the crowd around pinpointing it became almost impossible. He supposed he could ask where the Jinchuriki was, but if Taki was anything like Konoha or how Suna used to be, then he wouldn't meet with favorable responses. He sighed deeply to himself just looking around the place he had found himself in. It was some kind of market, a large one at that, given the number of stalls and shops that reminded him all too much of the merchant quarter in Suna, barely a few days away, and he was already feeling the pangs of homesickness. He chuckled to himself, earning a few strange looks from the residents that walked by. He could imagine that Taiyo would say in this situation, "Call yourself fucking shinobi, getting freaking homesick like a baby, grow a pair, you shithead, and get on with the fucking mission." He chuckled again, but nodded to the chibi Taiyo that had taken form in his head. Much to his amusement, he refocused on the task at hand, scanning the crowds for anything unusual that might lead him to his target. To anyone watching, he just appeared to be a regular citizen, stopping to the side of the busy streets to take a look around. However, in actuality, he was scanning every shop front, every face walked by, and every conversation taking place with a good 100-meter radius. When he was like this, he was the ultimate information gathering machine. Supposedly, private conversations instantly became known to him. He frowned when he struck out. All he got were a few corrupt shopkeepers and a couple of thieves. With a subtle one-handed seal, he produced 4 shadow clones in the darkness of the alleyway behind them. He masked the poof of their entry with a cough before they hinged and walked out into the busy streets. He calmly waited, just leaning up against the wall, knowing that his clones knew what they had to do. All throughout the village, the clones spread out, adopting the same technique as him to gather the information more efficiently. He grinned widely. After 10 years, when one of the clones found something and destroyed itself to relay the information to him, he quickly dispelled all his clones before the eventual information backlog would give him a headache. His smile had returned, even though it was tainted by slight hints of anger over what he had heard. The clone moved through the crowds expertly like a ghost. Nobody even noticed its existence as it weaved past them, never touching a soul. Finding a suitable spot to begin his observation, he settled against the wall. Much like his original, he extended his senses and waited like a fisherman calmly awaiting the tug of his reel, sorting his senses and sorting through useless transaction information. He finally struck lucky as he overheard a very interesting conversation coming from a few men near the end of the street. "I'm telling you, the Takakage is protecting her. It's like Takakage is protecting her. It's like he actually likes the title Demon Freak." His friend seemed to be against this. The puppy dog look of patriotism evident on his round features. "No way, Lord Chibiku would never condone the actions of that monster." The first man to talk just frowned. "I know the Takikage would never betray the village, but it's obvious he's stopping that little demon from getting the punishment she deserves." The third man, who had yet to speak, crossed his arms. A disgust looked overcoming his scarred and weathered face. Don't call that thing a she. It is nothing more than a blight on our fair village, tainting the sacred tree with its mere presence. I wouldn't be surprised if it's able to make the hero village if it isn't able to make the hero village this year, the hero water this year. No doubt it's trying to sabotage us from within. The man's companion nodded in solemn agreement. "But what are we going to do about it? Lord Chibiki will need the water to put on the regular display of power, which prevents the other villages from invading." It was the rounded man who spoke, earning more nods of agreement from his co-conspirators. "Easy," the scarred man spoke up, leaning out of the shadows to reveal a pair of onyx eyes, which sparkled with something the clone recognized all too well. "I happen to know that the demon is regularly seen around the east of the tree at night, always disappearing before anyone can get close. We'll go and set a trap for it there tonight. Finally rid our village of it before it can destroy us in turn." The clone grimaced in disgust of what he had heard before dispelling itself completely out of the awareness of the three conspirators. The real Naruto grimaced as well. It was like delving back into his own past. When all was said and done, Naruto thought he was going to have a word with Takakage. He seemed to be protecting the Jinchuriki, which he had at least gathered was female, much like the third had done for him. Yet, also known to him was just how effective such protection was, and Naruto had to hope that the man really did value the Jinchuriki as a person, not just a future weapon. He said he still had a few hours until nightfall, so he began to walk through the village, still keeping his ears open for any more information regarding the Jinchuriki. Anything on her appearance, age, or even what beads she carried would have been helpful. Most of all, Naruto had an instinctive urge to know the girl's or woman's, as the case may be named. He wasn't sure why, but he felt as though it was important. Naruto sat as still as possible in the lowest hanging branch of the massive tree he could find. Of the massive tree he could find that gave him a good view of its eastern flank. That was difficult in itself. The tree just seemed to be bigger the more Naruto looked at it, and the lowest branch he could find was well up on its weighty trunk. He also had to be careful from the reverent way the conspirators spoke about the tree. It was obviously precious to the nation. He was fairly certain climbing all over it would be a big no-no. He had arrived half an hour before sunset, securing himself quite comfortably to the branch he found, while his eyes constantly and vigorously scanned the ground below him. Finally, a few minutes after sunset, he saw movement in the bushes far below. He was far away, but he could still just about pick up a shock of mint green hair that almost perfectly blended with the cover. He smiled, hoping that this was who he was waiting for. That smile quickly turned ugly as he spotted 3 more rustles in the bushes not too far from the girl. Not that she didn't notice. The girl furtively looked around before tentatively speeding into the clearing that bordered a small pond. She looked around again before creeping over to the pond carefully, her ears primed for anything. Naruto sighed, remembering that was how he had been back in Konoha, never letting his guard down for a second. In those few moments, a deep, throaty chuckle could be heard as the 3 conspirators from earlier emerged from the bushes. Walking up to the now panicked girl, she looked ready to run forward, but the 3 men managed to surround her on each side, blocking off her escape routes. The girl cowered down, unable to escape the beating she was now sure to receive. Naruto knew better. This was no mere beating they had in mind. He knew these men had no intention of letting this girl live. The larger one he had first spotted was wielding a large sword braced on his shoulders. His stance looked a little strange, but he at least looked like he knew how to wield it. The scrawnier man had 2 knives, one in either hand, and he glanced around, obviously the one least comfortable with the situation. The last man, the scarred one that had actually suggested this horrific plan, was casually swinging a large chain through the air, the end fashioned into a knife that glinted in what little light the moon provided. Before they could even make a move towards the terrified girl, Naruto dropped the full 100 feet to the ground from his perch. His body slammed into the ground with considerable force, but he lightened the impact to tolerable levels by breathing out a harsh stream of wind chakra from his lungs to slow his fall. Even so, his body had caused a small crater in the ground, spiderweb cracks splintering outwards from his impact zone. He stood up to his full weight, which, when actually compared to the men before him, wasn't that tall. The men just seemed shocked to see anyone. When they saw the glint of his headband, they thought they had been found out by Takakari. However, when they saw the metal plate didn't bear their waterfall symbol, but the kanji for 9, they growled in annoyance with the scarred man stepping forward. "Who are you?" Naruto narrowed his eyes at the man. He would not kill him. He had technically done nothing wrong yet, but he was certainly going to make his experience unpleasant. "That's none of your concern. What you should be worried about is explaining why 3 fully grown men decided to attack a defenseless child at night, no less." He didn't hide the malice from his voice, but strangely the scarred man's posture softened slightly. "You misunderstand. The thing that stands before you cowering in a mock, taunting display of supposed fear is nothing but the Nanami. My friends and I were merely taking it upon ourselves to permanently erase its existence from the world forever. Now that you understand the situation, perhaps you would be willing to join us?" Naruto's eyes narrowed, and he unknowingly began to killer intent at the man before him, making the scrawny one cower slightly, his grip on the knives loosening. "The only monsters I see before me are you three." He settled into his main upright Taijutsu stance, increasing the killer intent as he did so. "As a shinobi, I am sworn to rid evils like you from the world." That was all that the middleman could take. Naruto's eyes seemed to be burning him from the inside out. He dropped his daggers and turned to run away, only to clothesline himself painfully on Naruto's outstretched arm. His companions blinked in shock. 1 second Naruto had stood in front of them, and the next he vanished and caught their friend before he could flee. Living in the shinobi village prepared you for the speeds they could move at, but even then Naruto's instantaneous movement was unreal. Unbeknownst to them, Naruto had taken the liberty of littering the area with his Fujin no Iki seals. He was lucky. If he had waited any longer, then they would have faded. What are you?" It was the large man who spoke, and as soon as he did so, Naruto appeared right in front of his face, so close that the man could see the jagged slits that occupied the boy's eyes. "You can call me Nine." With that, Naruto swiftly snatched the sword out of his grasp, snapping the poorly made blade over his knee and throwing the shattered remains to the side. He grabbed the man by the collar of his shirt before lifting him up with unexpected strength and throwing him with the same ease as his sword. The man sailed across the small clearing and impacted with his companion, who had only now begun to stand up. The two were quickly knocked unconscious from the double blow as Naruto shifted his attention to the scared man. "What are you doing? That little demon deserves to die." Naruto let out a very audible growl, a deep visceral sound that didn't belong in the throats of humans. In a flash of yellow, he was in front of the man, already having robbed the chain from the man, much to his surprise. That momentary hesitation would cost a shinobi his life, but this man was just a civilian. For Naruto to attack him properly would just be unnecessary. He twirled the chain expertly, used the ungained weapon, but still managed to twist it in the air to wrap around the last man expertly, safely holding him in place. With a disgust grimace, Naruto held onto the chain tighter and focused. In the next instant, the man found himself overlooking an enormous drop, 100 feet at least. Naruto just looked down, deciding this was high enough. He dug the blade of the weapon in the branch of the tree, making it secure before he simply dropped the man, letting him free fall for a few seconds before the chain went taut and the man was jerked violently back up. Naruto vanished again, appearing in the clearing only to look up. Sure enough, one could just about make out the form of the man hanging from the branch, with the chain wrapped tightly around his body. Naruto let out a calming breath, snarling slightly as he thought he might have gone slightly overboard. Takagakure was about to become a bad place for him to stay in a few hours, so he was going to have to quickly come up with an escape plan. He turned to the sound of sobs, his hardened and snarling features immediately softening when he saw the girl. Looking more closely now, he was probably a year or two younger than him. She had the mint green hair as he had seen before, and dark mocha skin. What drew Naruto's attention were her startling orange eyes. He didn't even think he could have eyes that color. Right now, those eyes were looking at him in a mix of terror and confusion. Naruto sighed and moved closer, but the girl immediately shied away from him, falling in her back. And shuffling with her arms towards the small lake near the base of the tree. Naruto stopped moving forward, unsure of how to approach the girl. Instead of doing that, he simply sat down where he was, adopting a cross-legged seating position as he just sat there watching her patiently. Slowly, the girl managed to move back to her feet, throwing glances between Naruto and the lake behind her before curiosity overcame the young mind. "Who are you?" Naruto smiled kindly, a warm smile that made the girl tense. She was obviously unused to such treatment and didn't know how to react. "I am Naruto Uzumaki." He spoke softly, much in contrast to the way he had spoken to the girl's assailants. Speaking of which, the mint-haired girl kept throwing looks at the two unconscious bodies behind Naruto. "Why did you help me?" Naruto smiled again. This time the girl didn't flinch, just stared at him strangely, but not lowering her guard. Because if I hadn't, you might be dead now. The girl gasped a little bit, but suddenly became even more defensive than before. Why would you even care? Naruto tried to maintain his smile as best he could, but he suddenly found it hard as anger flared through him at the thought of what these people had done to this girl. Because we're the same. Again, the girl seemed distressed, staring at Naruto with so many questions that she didn't know what to say. What do you mean, the same? Naruto frowned and shook his head, looking around as he heard the very distant sound of running footsteps. We can't talk here anymore. Is there a safe place you can go? Is somewhere where you hide? The girl seemed unsure, but nodded her head softly. Can you take me there? Suddenly, all the defenses were back up as the girl scooted away from Naruto towards the lake. Listen, we don't have much time. People are coming, and it would probably be best we aren't here when they show up. The girl might have been frightened by Naruto's presence, but the thought of more people was even more terrifying. Her other fears overridden, the girl just pointed to the lake before turning and diving in. Seconds later, Naruto joined her, shooting through the cool waters like a bullet as he quickly located the girl. She swam away from him sloppily, using a much improvised style to propel herself through the waters of a roughly human-sized tunnel. Naruto stayed on her trail, and soon both of them gasped as they emerged from a pool inside the tree itself. They both pulled themselves onto the roughly carved floor of the strange room, and the girl quickly put as much distance between her and Naruto as possible. It wasn't much in the small wooden room, but it was enough for the girl to feel slightly safer. Naruto sat down again, exactly as he had before, noticing that the room seemed to be lit somehow. He looked up at the ceiling only to see a multitude of what looked like bright glowing orange crystals. He quickly realized that it was the sap of the tree, hardened into resin, which let in the light of the moon high above them. What's your name? Naruto again spoke in his soft tone. He really didn't have to upset the girl at this point. After a moment of hesitation and internal debate, the girl looked back at him in a mix of defiance and caution. Fu. End of chapter 32.